That was extremely challenging. You know, I ended up getting depression for a good 4 years during that period because I just didn't know how to cope. So it took a huge toll on me. It took a toll on my relationship with my dad. It took a toll on our whole family.
Yeah. Welcome again to the Figuring Life Out Together podcast. And today we're going to have a look at the topic of mental health and in particular, what it's like to have someone close to you struggle in this area. We speak to Caitlin, whose father was diagnosed with a mental illness 15 years ago. We share how tough this was, the impact it had on her life. Ultimately, hers is a story of hope, and she shares some great insights into what it's like and what has helped her through this time. Caitlin, well, it's great to have you on the show.
Good afternoon.
Yeah. Have you been on a podcast before?
I can't say that I have.
Well, it's perfect.
First time for me, yeah.
Yeah.
Have you been on a podcast before?
Only on my own. Still waiting for my own flip the script and someone interview me.
You're waiting to be invited to be on a podcast?
Yes. Well, that could happen.
Well, maybe I'll make a podcast and then I'll invite you on mine.
It would be an honour.
Yeah, well,
but today
we'll see how we go.
Talking a bit about mental illness.
Yep.
And your experiences with that. Let's just start. How would you define a mental illness?
I think everyone who's experienced it personally would say it a bit differently, and then what I would say is different again from someone that's a professional in the area. But I think for me, I would say it's an imbalance of chemicals in your brain that causes symptoms in your life. And it really affects how you live your life on a day-to-day basis.
I'd say there's a lot of misconceptions about that. What are some that you've heard? I
think the things that I've seen and I've heard a lot in my own personal experience is seeing mental illness as a moral failing or a personal failing, sometimes even a spiritual failing, that somehow that person has done something wrong to deserve having the symptoms they have and having the experiences they have, and that, you know, it's a punishment also almost on them for, you know, things they have done.
Yeah, right. So it's not any of those things?
I don't consider it to be any of those things. You know, with any illness, with anything that affects your life, there's, you know, genetic and there's environmental, and we have some control over the environmental. We have no control over who our parents are and what we're predisposed to. But, you know, there's plenty of people that, you know, live their life a certain way and never see any consequences from it. And then there's plenty of people that live life a certain way and seem to get every, you know, possible health issue as a result of that. So, you know, I think it's very limited to say that how a person lives their life, you know, cause or doesn't cause mental illness. A lot of the time we don't get to pick the situation that we find ourselves in. A
bit like saying it's somebody's fault for being physically ill, would you say?
Absolutely, yeah. I think we don't see the brain as an organ. We somehow forget that. And so, you know, if someone gets diabetes or, you know, some problems with their lungs, people go, oh, you know, that's so sad, I'm so sorry for you. But if there's an illness in the brain, they go, oh, what have you done wrong to deserve this? Like, you know, this is a you problem. So
compassion often is the best response.
Yeah, and I think curiosity rather than judgment.
Yeah.
You know, understanding a person's experience rather than going, well, you've done something to cause this, you need to get yourself out of it.
Talk to the person.
Yeah.
So you've grown up 15 years in the same family as someone with mental illness. Can you just tell me a bit about that experience? Yeah, so, you know, I left school, I turned 18, and then, you know, in that first year of uni, my dad was diagnosed with a psychiatric illness, one main one, but then also if you have a mental illness, often things like depression and anxiety will go hand in hand with that. So, and that was very challenging. I'd never really known anyone diagnosed with a mental illness or, you know, anything like that. So it was a huge change for me, but also, you know, outside of this idea of, oh, someone that I love has an illness I've never heard of before, it's also just the practical realities of my whole life changed, and that was very difficult as well. Yeah, right. Did you see that before the diagnosis in your dad? I think after we found out what the issue was, I could look back and I could see, you know, he'd become more withdrawn over the past few years and more quiet and, you know, not his normal self. But
I think you don't, it's, I said this to you before we started recording, but it's the frog in the boiling water. Like, you don't really know how much change has happened over a period of time until something makes you see it. That was our normal up until the point when, this all makes sense now.
How did your dad go about explaining it to you?
I think he didn't really explain it to me because he was very unwell by the time he was diagnosed. So there was a sort of a series of events of realising that, he wasn't well, something wasn't right. And, my mum had explained that to me. And initially it was just the shock of understanding that, something was very wrong and not really understanding what was wrong. One of the biggest symptoms of my dad's mental illness was actually alcoholism. So he'd been self-medicating for his mental health problems since he was a teenager. And, because alcohol is such a big part of Australian culture, I think, and culture in general, no one ever recognised that as a symptom. They just thought, he likes to drink. And we didn't even realise how much alcohol he was using until it all came out. And initially we just thought, he's got a problem with alcohol like this, and there was that initial thing, and it took a little while to realise, okay, there's more going on under the surface. And sometimes you can see the symptoms of mental illness and think, that's just someone's personal failing. He's, addicted to alcohol, and not realise that, no, that's actually just how, and incorrectly, using alcohol to self-treat a mental illness isn't healthy at all. But it's how he was trying to cope with something much deeper going on.
Yeah, right. So how did that happen? How did he come to be diagnosed, go and see somebody?
Well, I think once we sort of realised there was a problem, he went downhill very fast. So he'd been coping and high-functioning alcoholism and coping with everything else that was going on for a long time. And then when it all kind of came out that, there was this whole other part of him that we weren't seeing, he went downhill very quickly. He got very bad depression, very bad anxiety. And he just, every little thing that he'd built up over 40 years to be able to cope with what was going on just crumbled, and he was no longer able to cope. So he ended up in psychiatric hospital, and that's where he was diagnosed because he was so unwell. And he just couldn't cope with day-to-day life.
Do you think there was a particular trigger that caused that rapid descent?
Well, what happened after we found out, about the alcohol and everything he was doing to cope, that was definitely the trigger that caused that downhill spiral. But probably about 5 years before, both my father and my mother's parents all died in a 2-year period, and some of them under quite traumatic scenarios. So I think that was what really started to accelerate his mental illness and make it so that he was working so much harder to cope, and the alcoholism got worse. And, he became more withdrawn and more quiet. He wasn't talking, and, he wasn't getting any help with dealing with that, and it sort of all just kind of got too big for him to handle.
Yeah. How's he doing now?
He's doing awesome now, yeah. Like I think our relationship now is so much better than it was when I was in my late teens, and I'm so thankful. This isn't everyone's experience with a family member with mental illness, but, my dad has worked really hard, and he's gone and he's got a psychiatrist and a psychologist, and he's worked really hard to get to a place where he is well and he can function. But that's been 10-15 year process
to get to that place.
Yeah, and he's had good years and bad years, but I'm so thankful for all the work that he has put in over those years. To rebuild relationship with our family members and to be well in himself, because you can try and heal for other people, but ultimately you also have to heal for yourself, and that he's wanting to have a life that he can be healthy and he can be well for himself as well.
Do you think there's things that you as family members did that helped your dad through that?
My mum was astonishing. Like, anyone that ever hears our story just is in awe of my mum. I'm in awe of my mum. She just stayed by his side, and she wasn't very happy with him a lot of the time. It was really, really hard, and it wasn't easy on her at all. But she, what she would say to me is, she's like, "Caitlin, he's my best friend." So, even though it was so hard on her, she was just consistently there to support him. And a lot of people said to me, "I don't know if I could do that," and I say to them, "I don't know if I could do that." Like, it was very, very difficult, and I watched how difficult it was for her. But she was just consistently always there supporting him.
She obviously had hope for him then. You think?
Yes and no. I think you do hope. I think I can only speak from my experience. I was hopeful that he would get better, but at times I didn't think he would get better. And it was more about, okay, we just have to deal with the situation in front of us. So I think she was hopeful, but at the same time I think she was trying to do the best she could regardless of the outcome. And she just had to do what she felt was right in that season.
So what are some of the ways that life got hard or harder?
The way I described it at the time was that it felt like my dad had died, because I had this dad that I was really close to, in the sense we'd have really close conversations, and he was so funny and intelligent, and we would laugh and we'd all go to dinner and those sorts of things, and that just all went away. And then suddenly he was just, there's a tiredness, but he was just so sad and angry and withdrawn all the time. So the way I would describe it was like, I feel like my dad died and this stranger moved into my house that suddenly I had to live with, even though I didn't know who that person was. So as like a teenager, like 18 years old, that was extremely challenging. And I ended up getting depression for a good 4 years during that period, because I just didn't know how to cope with what had happened. I was going through uni and all of that. So it took a huge toll on me. It took a toll on my relationship with my dad. It took a toll on our whole family. So it's easy to sit here now and go, oh yeah, everything's great now, but it was very, very challenging.
Very hard. Yeah. Did anyone recognise that depression in you? And
no.
No. Really?
I was very good at covering, because I didn't see it in myself. It wasn't until like after 4 years that I really recognised that's what it was. I just thought I was tired. I just thought life was difficult because of uni, and I just had to get through it. So I just, I'd go out with my friends, or I'd come to church and be like, how are you? And I'm like, oh, everything's fine, because, I didn't really understand it myself. And even if I did, it's too hard to try and explain to someone in a cursory conversation. Right. So I just kind of got on with it until I couldn't physically do that anymore.
And what happened then?
I think I have this memory, because I was studying to be a midwife and a nurse, and I'm a midwife and nurse, so I graduated. And I have this memory of being on a night shift at about 2 a.m, and one of these new mums was buzzing for help, and I just couldn't go answer the buzzer. I got so angry and so upset in myself. I'm trying to be calm on the outside and professional, but I just couldn't go answer the buzzer, and internally I'm thinking like, why are you buzzing? I have nothing to give you. And I think that was my rock bottom of going, wow, my tank is completely empty. I have nothing left to give. This isn't what being healthy feels like. This isn't what being well feels like. I think that was when I first realised, okay, there's something going on.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So where did you turn then? What did you do?
Well, I mentioned earlier that all my grandparents had died very close to each other, and I was very thankful and very lucky that my mum had got me into therapy at that point, so from when I was 14. So I think my psychologist, she probably knew there was stuff going on, but I didn't fully tell her everything, because I didn't like to admit when I was struggling, and I didn't fully understand how much I was struggling myself. So I think she probably had a bit of an inclination, but I was very good at pretending everything was fine. But I already had a relationship with her, so when I realised things were not okay, I was already in therapy, and I could start to be a bit more open and be like, oh, look, this is what's happening. And we started to work on the practical things you can work on. There's a lot of the things you can't work on with mental health, but some practical things that helped me. So things like working on my diet. I wasn't eating very well. I wasn't sleeping very well. My iron levels were low. So those were the first steps for me, was, okay, what can we practically work on to make it a little bit easier for you to cope? And then at the same time, of course, you have to work on the stuff that's not physical, the psychological stuff in your mind and all of your experiences that have caused you to be in the situation you're in. So it was a very difficult experience, but looking back now, I can kind of see the journey into it and the journey out of it. But yeah, it's an interesting thing to look back on now after so many years.
I can imagine it's all interconnected. So was it hard to like work on your diet and your sleep and physical health when you're going through that?
I think yes and no, but by that point I'd hit rock bottom. I'd realised there was a problem and I didn't want to stay there. Mm-hmm. And my dad always said to me, even growing up, which is a funny thing to look back on now, but he used to say that change is never going to happen until the pain of changing is less than the pain of remaining the same.
Yeah.
And that was true, I think, with his mental health journey and with mine. I didn't want to stay where I was. Mm-hmm. I wanted things to be better, so that helped push me to make the changes I needed to make and those sorts of things.
Do you think, looking back, there's anything both in your journey and your dad's journey where, that something could have been done earlier, or that's just the way it had to play out?
I think that's a really good question, because Dad actually went through I kind of think of it as two different parts in his mental health journey. The first part I mentioned earlier, he was really doing it for me and Mum. He wanted to get better for us. And that worked for a while, and then that stopped working. And that's when he really had to go, okay, I want to get better for me.
Yeah, right.
So, I've had conversations with my psychologist before about, I wish that so-and-so would go to therapy, or, I wish that this was situation. She sort of said to me, you can't push anyone into therapy. You can drive them to the appointment and you can make them sit in the chair, but unless they want to be there, nothing's going to change. So with my dad, I hazard a guess that it kind of just had to happen the way it happened. It had to all unfold because he didn't, know that he needed help until he realised he needed help. And that was my experience as well. I wouldn't have accepted, I was already in therapy, but until I was ready to recognise that I had a problem and that I didn't want things to stay the same way forever, there wasn't any meaningful change being made.
Okay, so what's the best thing a friend or a family member can do if somebody they love and care about is in that stage of not recognising it?
It's difficult because there's not actually a lot you can do, which is a hard thing to say, but consistency. I have had friends where I've looked at them and I've gone, I wonder, because I'm seeing things that I went through and that I'm recognising with. And, even with my dad, sometimes he'll go through periods where he's doing really well and he'll be periods where he's struggling. And I might just say something like, have you considered that? Or I've noticed that maybe, and you just sort of ask probing, gentle questions. I don't think it's really helpful to look someone in the eye and tell them you have a serious problem and you need to change. Because I think that's sort of the very end of the road, unless you're in a completely dire situation and that's the only thing you can do, they're probably not going to respond too well to that. They're probably going to feel a bit affronted and a bit judged. So I think, like I said before, curiosity rather than judgment, you sort of just ask little probing questions like, have you noticed that your mood does this? Or have you considered that maybe, you might be dealing with a little bit of depression? And, I had a relationship where I said that to that person every 6 months for a couple of years. And then, they got to a point where they're like, oh, actually, maybe, yes, I do recognise this in myself. And I'd sort of just open those doors. So when that person was ready to have that conversation, we'd already kind of pre-discussed it and then sort of laid the groundwork for it. So curiosity, I think, is a good way to approach things and gentleness, because it's very easy to bring our own frustrations into the situation because, supporting someone with mental health can be very frustrating because you want things to change and they're not changing, and that can just be really hard to watch. But, bringing your frustrations to someone that's struggling is probably not the best way of handling it.
Yeah, so there's layers of support. The supporters need support themselves.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And if I was going to say one thing to someone supporting someone with mental health, like you have to take care of yourself first. I'm a midwife. I say this to new mums all the time. Like, you have to put the oxygen mask on yourself before you can help anyone else. Because if you're completely burnt out and drained, you're not going to provide any support whatsoever. So it's really taking care of yourself first and understanding how much you can give, and then just being consistent with what you can do, rather than feeling like you have to do absolutely everything and then burning out every 6 weeks or every 6 months.
I guess recognising it's going to be a long-term journey might help, that you don't throw yourself in beyond what you can sustain.
Yeah. I was chatting to someone recently and their sibling had just been diagnosed with mental health illness, and at first I was just so overcome with grief for them because I could see they were at the very start of a journey that I've been on for like 15 years. And initially I was like, oh, honey. But, telling them this is going to be 15 hard years of work is not very encouraging.
No.
But, just saying to them, like, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. I don't even think marathon's the right term because, you're a marathon runner after about half a day, you're done and you get to go home. But it's
longer than that.
Yeah, it's a very, very long process. And, I think if you can be consistent with a little bit of support, that's better than being like everything and then nothing and then everything and then nothing. Just, being consistent with what you can give and then taking care of yourself as well.
And I guess for you now, you've found that, there's a light at the end of the tunnel.
Yep.
That it's that journey.
Yeah.
When you look back on that, is it something that you think, I wish I didn't have to go through that? Or is there a silver lining that you can see now when you look back?
That's a difficult one because I think I have a very, maybe not a unique story, but I have one of the better case scenario stories. The person that, my dad, he was willing to put in time and effort and he wanted to see change. And that's not everyone's story. And it's not even so much about if the person wants to change or not, or if they're willing to put time and effort in, and that those things are important. But sometimes no matter what a person does, they just can't seem to have freedom from their symptoms and have freedom from their illness. And it's very easy to speak from personal experience and be like, oh, this was my experience and there's light at the end of the tunnel and it's great and it's all going to be great. But, even though I feel like I've had a very positive experience with my dad, it's not like he's cured. No. It's not like we hit a point where like, oh, he's fixed now, everything's back to normal. And so, other people might look at our scenario and go, oh, wow, that's so difficult. Like what you deal with is so difficult. But for us, we've reached a normal that works for us. And that's, we're thrilled that we're in this position. But, I don't think mental illness is the way I describe it for myself with my depressions. My depression isn't gone. It's that I'm in remission. I'm no longer experiencing those symptoms, feeling tired, not getting out of bed, not being able to shower, not experiencing any joy, those sorts of things. Like I don't experience those symptoms currently, but I know if I don't take care of myself, I can very much end back up in that space. So I'd say, yes, there's light at the end of the tunnel, but it's not that sense of, everything will be fixed and it'll all go back to the way it was. You find a new normal and you find a new way of dealing with the challenges you have in life. Yep. And to another person, it might look like your life is really difficult and they're like, oh, I could never do all of that. That's really hard, but you'll find a place where you feel better about things and you find a place where you can manage with what you have to deal with. So yes, there is light at the end of the tunnel, but it's not a sense of everything's going to be fixed 100%. It's like you're going to find a way to get through that works for you.
The problem's still there, but you've adjusted, you've learnt about the problem and you're in a place where that problem's there, but almost you've grown around it, you've grown to be able to handle that. So become a stronger person, would you say?
I think I have become a stronger person. I think the one, if I could say, you asked me before, I didn't answer it, would I wish that I hadn't gone through all of this? I think no. I wish that my dad wasn't in pain. I wish that he hadn't been in pain. I wish my mum hadn't been in pain. And I guess to a certain extent, I wish I hadn't been in pain. But going through all of that helps me to understand other people's pain better. It makes me have more sympathy and empathy for others. Less in my little bubble of childhood where nothing ever goes wrong and no one ever has any problems, and more an adult of like, all right, life can get really, really difficult and I understand a part of that. So I'm going to come to those situations with that curiosity and that gentleness and not just assuming that that person's done something wrong to be in that situation or it's self-inflicted. So
well, if there's someone listening to this that's in quite a desperate situation, let's say, what would you say to someone?
That's a tough one because it's easy to say this is what I did. Everyone's situation looks different, and the first thing I say to anyone is you need to ask for help. But it's also hard to get help these days. We know COVID has put a lot of mental illness. It's caused a lot of problems, and it's hard to get help these days. You can go to your GP, you can get a referral for a psychologist, you can go on medication, but you might not be able to get the help that you need for a long period of time, and that can be really difficult. I think recognizing you do need help is very powerful. And then, just start with the small things, because you can't tackle it all at once. So, you go see your GP and they will refer you for help. But all right, what is one thing that I can start working on that's going to make things a little bit better? Because you can't. It is a long-term walk. It's usually not a short-term fix. And if you feel like you have to tackle all of it all at once, it's overwhelming. So asking for help and then just working on one thing at a time.
One thing at a time.
One thing.
Yep.
So, for me, it was, okay, my iron levels are so low, that's why I'm having trouble getting out of bed, on top of being depressed. So, I went to the GP and I got on iron tablets and I got regular blood tests. And, that was the first thing that I worked on, was just, okay, just going to fix my iron levels.
Is there a medical basis to what I'm feeling?
And it doesn't mean that was my whole issue, but once my iron levels were better, I had a little bit more energy and a little bit more ability to, okay, what's the next thing I want to work on?
It's like building blocks, one brick at a time to build the wall.
Yeah, and that's, I think you do need that professional advice though, because every person's situation is different, so the GP's a good place to start.
Just tell me at the end here, how has your faith played out through all of this? Were there times where you were wondering, how could God let somebody go through this and that sort of thing?
I think the first 4 years when I had depression and I was sort of reeling through all of this, my faith felt very dormant. It felt very grey. The way I would describe my whole life feels grey. There's no white, there's no black, it's just all shades of grey. And then I think that moment that I realised I needed help, I realised that God had brought me to that moment. And one of the things that I did when I needed help was I went and I asked for one of the ladies in our church to pray for me. And that was a very significant moment for me spiritually, because I'd been trying to do it all myself. I'd just been trying to cope and deal with it. And I needed physical help, but I also needed spiritual help. And I think spiritually, letting go of trying to do it all myself and asking God for help made a huge difference. And then I started to see physically in my life, but also spiritually, that the help would come. And it wasn't like I was fixed overnight. Someone didn't pray for me and I got instantly healed of my depression and never had an issue again. But I started to see that one step at a time, that little by little, God would help me with the first thing, and then you'd see a bit of a victory there, and then you'd help with the second thing, and then the first thing would need more work, so you'd go back. And so it wasn't very much like God fixed it and 1, 2, 3 done. It was very much of seeing God providing the help for the next step. And sometimes you do feel like you're going in circles, but God was always there to pick me back up and to keep going.
Not to be discouraged if it's not fixed straight away, but to keep going, keep taking that step. That helps a little bit. It's not
how many times you fall down, it's how many times you pick yourself back up. So I didn't even have to pick myself back up. God was always there to help me. Yeah. And just that encouragement in those moments where it felt too difficult to keep going.
If somebody watching or listening would like to reach out to you, would you be open to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Could they contact you?
I'm on Facebook. I don't check my Facebook very often. I'm here on a Sunday at Catalyst, or you could get in contact with Tom and he can put you in contact with me. But yes, very happy to chat to anyone if they would like to chat.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for chatting with us today, Caitlin.
Thank you for having me.
Very brave and powerful story.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think Caitlin shared very well then. What do you think? Let us know in the comments what stood out to you most. And I would encourage you to get in contact with either Caitlin or myself. You can send me a message. Check out what we're all about at haventogether.com. Otherwise, if you're interested in listening to some more podcasts, I encourage you to check out one we've done recently with Portia about social health. Hope you can join us again next time for the Figuring Life Out Together podcast.